Thank you very much.
Thank you, Comrade President. And from the program,
begin to transcend this mechanistic approach.
We're hearing on electoral reforms. NLC have a very long history of participating in electoral reform processes. All of us could remember that we participated on the Justice Uwais electoral reform process that actually midwife reforms in our electoral process. As an organization, we firmly believe that we must continue to improve on our electoral processes and systems that will guarantee free, fair, transparent, and credible election devoid of any violence. We have seen that over the years, election days and venues have been turned to theaters of war, which ought not to be. If election is to elect credible leaders that will then in turn serve the people, then we must create an atmosphere that will be free, fair, and credible for people to elect their leaders freely, without molestation and without any act of violence. We have also seen that in the current laws, there are some improvements that are required, especially how to ensure that electoral offenders don't also go scot-free. So we remain committed to a genuine process of reforming our electoral process that will actually make the process free, fair, and credible. And that is why we are conveying this process. We have, in the past, jointly worked with civil society, and we will continue to do that, so that when there is an opportunity to actually review the law, which I think there is a commitment by the current National Assembly to actually have the electoral reform process concluded before the end of this year. And that is why we are starting this process, so that labor and civil society will be able to have a platform to come up with recommendations and suggestions, including amendments that will improve our electoral system. That is why we are having this roundtable today. And therefore, I want to once again thank Yiaga for partnering with NLC and the civil society allies to have this roundtable. I'm hopeful that it will provide an opportunity for us to interrogate the issue towards improving our electoral process, and towards also for all of us to take responsibility and ensure that our votes count and there is peace during the electionary period. Enough of bloodshed just because of election, and you find out people are being killed, and in many election venues there is mayhem. While we will continue to call on our security agencies to provide maximum security on election days, we will also call and ensure that those offenders must not go scot-free. Whichever party they belong to, I think, to serve as deterrent, people that foment trouble and kill others or cause violence and mayhem on election days, certainly we must find space in our laws to actually ensure that they are not only identified, but they are also punished, so that it can serve as deterrent. Once again, comrades, I thank you immensely. I want to... This is what is obtainable in many climes. You don't perform, you even resign on your own. You don't need to wait for another election. And we have seen in many countries, because of the credible electoral process, people in office are very accountable to the people that elected them. And I think that is the way to go, and I think you have actually laid the foundation. Let me then allow the General Secretary to invite our partner to be able to also give us his perspective. But essentially, I think your presentation will form the crux of the discussion that will then make us to actually look at areas where we need those reforms. And I think that is the way to go. Thank you very much.
Oh, great. Let me thank the President of Council and the GS, and to everyone, good morning. And thanks to Prof for this agenda that you put forward. I think some of the issues you've raised, I also raised them in my presentation, but I will just quickly run through the slides so we can have a very robust discussion. Let's move to the next slide. So what I have done is, my presentation is in about 5 different parts, but I'm just going to run through them and just skip them. There are 3, can I go to the next slide? So first, I will talk about the electoral reform journey, and then why electoral reform is necessary now, and then what are those issues, and lastly look at what are considerations, and some of them Prof has highlighted. Let's move to the next slide. Next. Okay, this. Now, so far we've had, no, to the previous slide, sorry. So to talk about the journey, there's a slide before that. There are about 4 different attempts that have been made to amend the Electoral Act. 2010 Electoral Amendment, that was assented by the President in 2010, which is the current Act. Then we moved to 2011, another also assented by President Jonathan. And then the third one in 2015. You recall there was an act that was amended 2 days before the 2015 elections, but that was not made public. And that's the 2015 Amendment Act. And then the last attempt that was made was before the 2019 elections. And in that particular case, the President declined assent to the bill 4 different times. So these are attempts or amendments that have been made. The next slide. So why do we need electoral reforms now? First is the question of the cost of elections. If you look at, based on data from INEC, if you look from 2011 to 2019, the cost of elections have actually shot. So in 2011, we spent 139 billion naira on elections, and according to INEC, the cost per voter was about 1,800 naira, and that's about $9. In 2015, the cost reduced to 116 billion, and it cost about 1,600 per voter. But in 2019, according to INEC, we spent 182 billion naira on the elections, and it cost about 2,249 naira per voter. So we can see that the cost of elections is increasing by the year. The next slide. The other issue is around the election petitions. If you look from 2007 to 2019, the figures for election petitions first started very high, and then we went down the spiral, and then we're going up again. So in 2007, there were 1,200 cases, election petitions. 2011, it was 732. 2015, it was 611. And then in 2019, we are told that it's 809. Although, based on what the information available to stakeholders, that most of these cases in 2019 are mainly pre-election matters drawn from the pre-election cases. We don't know what will happen in 2023. But the reason why this is a factor is if you want to look at the quality of our elections and the electoral process, look at the cases that are filed in the courts and some of the revelations about how elections were conducted and the shenanigans of our political parties. The other issue is about the turnout of voters. So increasingly, we're seeing how there's a decline in the turnout of voters for elections. Look at 1999, where we were about 52.3%. Look at where we are today in 2019, we're about 34%. In fact, 2015, we're about 43.7% turnout, and this is for presidential elections. But in 2019, there was a decline. Now, what is interesting is, how come the number of registered voters is rising, but the number of turnout for elections is declining? And that you can see if you compare 2015 elections and 2019. And what this simply tells you, and that's the point Prof was also making, that increasingly as people lose touch with governance, they see no reason why they should come out at elections. That's a factor, no doubt. But again, also the nature of our elections and this do-or-die nature of our politics and the insecurity and violence also prevents people from coming out for elections. The next slide. The other point is the gestation period for electoral amendment bills, and this is why this is very, very important and this urgency. If you look at the 7th National Assembly, the process for amending the Electoral Act started in 2012. The National Assembly concluded the amendments in the 7th Assembly in March 2015. And by that same March 2015, the President assented to the bill. In the 8th Assembly, the process started in March 2016, and then it ended in March 2017. And by March 2017, the National Assembly transmitted the bill to President Buhari, but the bill was declined 4 times, and the last was in December 2018, which was just few weeks to the 2019 elections. The next slide. What is interesting about this is you can see that by March of 2017, the National Assembly had concluded its work on electoral amendments. That's 2 years to the 2019 elections. Now, as of today, we are about 914 days to the 2023 elections, and that's 30 months and 2 years and 6 2 years and 6 months, if you put it that way, 2 years and 6 months. So where the National Assembly was in the 8th Assembly, we're somewhat at that stage now, but the National Assembly has not concluded its work on electoral reforms. And that is very, very problematic, and that's the need for the urgency to pass these reforms, as we have been told. Next slide. Now, in the National Assembly, there are current bills on electoral reform. There are 9 of them on electoral reform. The first bill, which is considered the principal bill, is a bill by the Deputy Senate President, Senator Ovioma Agege. Now, that bill is just a refurbished bill that was passed by the 8th National Assembly. And so it's like a carryover, but it was sponsored by the Deputy Senate President and Senator Kyari. That bill has passed 2nd reading, and we are awaiting public hearing by the National Assembly, and it contains several amendments. The second bill is the Electoral Offenses Commission bill, and the President of Council had hinted in the course of his remark that there's need to increase, accountability for electoral offenses. So there's an Electoral Offenses Commission bill that has also scaled 2nd reading, and we're waiting for the public hearing on that. The next slide. The third bill in the National Assembly is the bill prohibiting INEC commissioners from engaging in partisan politics within 5 years of retirement. You remember before the Bayelsa election, one of the recs in Cross River had, resigned to contest for the governorship of Bayelsa elections. Now, this particular amendment seeks to preclude any INEC commissioner from engaging in partisan politics 5 years after retirement. That bill was just passed for 2nd reading before the National Assembly went on recess. The 4th bill is the bill on liability for INEC for candidate exclusion. And that's the bill sponsored by Honorable Frederick Agbedi. Next slide. The 5th bill is the one sanctioning persons guilty of coercing INEC officials for declaring election results under duress. This was sponsored by Senator Uche Okwunife, and this bill seeks to correct, what happened in the 2019 elections, where politicians forced INEC officials to declare results at gunpoint. Now, this bill prescribes sanctions for that malfeasance or that particular fraud. The 6th bill is a bill to establish National Institute for Electoral Studies. That's also there. The 7th bill, which is a very important bill of interest to everybody, is a bill that was just sponsored by the chair of the House Committee on Electoral Matters, and that's a bill to repeal the current Electoral Act and then enact a new act. So we would have a new act that will be the Electoral Act 2020, as opposed to an amendment, but to have a fresh new act, which in our view is actually a good way to go. But if you look at this bill, it's pretty much a compilation of the amendments proposed in the 8th Assembly. So what you have in this bill is a replica of the bill that was sponsored by the Deputy Senate President in the Senate. The next slide. The 8th bill is, the 8th and 9th bill is sponsored by His Honorable Taiwo Oluga, and it's on representation of women in elective offices. Oops. Oh, the mic. The next slide. So these are the current bills in the National Assembly. I will not go through what are the provisions of these bills, because we do have them in the slides, and you can have the presentation will be available if you want them, but we can make this available. The next slide. But this particular proposed amendment, where a candidate dies, is to correct the lacuna in the law, or what we saw with the Kogi elections, when late Prince Abubakar Audu died before the election was concluded. So that particular proposed amendment seeks to correct that. There are also amendments on electronic voting, and that is contained in the bill sponsored by Ove, the Deputy Senate President. Next slide. Yeah, we can just run through them. Let's move. Yeah, these are just some of the provisions, and you can have them because the bills are out there. Next. 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 Okay, wait. Okay, go back. Oh, you've got, let's go back. 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 Africa, our own proposals and an agenda that we propose is, first, there is need to strengthen the financial autonomy of INEC by providing legal timelines for the release of funds to INEC. If you look at our 2019 report, we have it on good record that the funding for the 2019 elections, a large chunk of it was not provided to INEC until about a few weeks to the elections. And it was clear that the government intentionally delayed funding for INEC to perform and deliver on the 2019 elections. And that is very problematic for the integrity of our electoral process. And so it's important to have legal stipulations on clear timelines when funds should be released to INEC to conduct elections. The second, of course, is the legal recognition for electronic accreditation, and as well as transmission of results. The other issue is, the need to subject declarations or returns made by returning officers under duress or controversial circumstances. Because the law is very, very clear. I think under Section 68, that once a declaration is made, only the court can upturn or review that declaration. And that is why politicians have capitalized on that Section 68 to circumvent elections. And all they are interested in is how to get polling officials to declare results. Declare and let's go to court. Now, those declarations, we can introduce, amendments to our law that actually subjects declarations made under duress or controversial circumstances by review, to review by the Commission. Of course, the other issue is also the power to reject candidates, or what you call disqualify candidates, because it's been a subject of contestation even with the recent judgment released on the Bayelsa governorship election, where a political party fielded an underage candidate, and INEC is reported to have written to the political party to notify them that they filed an invalid nomination. Now, when you have cases of this nature, it is important that relevant sections, particularly Section 87 and 31 of the Electoral Act, should be amended to give INEC that power, to disqualify candidates where political parties do not file valid nomination. So these are some of the issues that, for us, we consider priority issues. Also the issue of political inclusion for women, youth, and persons with disability. Next slide. Also was the need to set a timeline for December of 2020. Yes, the National Assembly is accelerating the process of reforms, but there is need to set a timeline. And December 2020 is a feasible timeline for concluding this process. Because if this moves into 2021, as you can see, that it appears we're already in the 2023 elections, and the politicians are already strategizing, and so the preoccupation and what would influence electoral amendments by 2021 will be pretty much politics and how this confers political advantage on political parties. The next slide. Next. As I try to conclude, there are a few considerations that are important for the NLC and for citizens to keep at the back of their mind. And this is the point that Professor Ibianu has made earlier, but I won't just belabor or repeat what he said, that yes, we need to consider electoral reform as part of a broader, democratic reform project. And that electoral reform should be conceptualized as a process that confers or delivers public good to the people and ensures social stability and national development. So it's not just this technicist approach towards amending some relevant sections of our law. The next slide. And to add that electoral reforms should extend beyond constitutional reforms. There are also administrative reforms that can be undertaken. And then also the issue of the dilemma of reforms. First is the question of political will. Political will is very, very critical for both the key actors, the executive, the legislature, as well as citizens and political parties. The timing is very, very important. We're about 914 days to the 2023 elections. We should, as a country, conclude electoral reforms by December of 2020 if we are very serious about free, fair elections in 2023. The other issue we also need to deal with is this perception that electoral amendment can limit chances of future electoral victory. One of the things that politicians, and that is why it is important that we don't extend this beyond 2020, because what our politicians will be more concerned about is how an amendment guarantees their victory in 2023. We saw that happen in the 2019 elections, and we don't want a repeat of that. The other issue is about prioritization. We need to prioritize which key issues would need, amendments to our elections, and then go after them. The next slide. Next, and perhaps that's the last. Of course, as I conclude, there is need for national consensus on priority issues. People have talked about increased technology, the independence of INEC, and I want to join, the call that we need to review the appointment process of national commissioners and the chairman of INEC. It is very, very important. It was clearly stated in the Justice Ways Committee's recommendation, but the appointment process, if it's not transparent, if it's not inclusive, and is enmeshed, in politics, we would have problems with the independence of the Electoral Commission, and that's very key. And so we need that national consensus. Of course, Prof also talked about, citizens' engagement and citizens' mobilization. And the NLC has been in the forefront of galvanizing not just workers, but citizens. We are witnesses to the role that the NLC played in the Justice Ways Committee's recommendations. And the GS who is here was also part of that struggle, building a national citizens movement that seeks to demand, political reforms in this country. And there were a lot of gains. We need to see that in this particular process. The other point is to hold the president and the legislature to account for their commitment to electoral reforms. The president, on his birthday, talked about electoral reforms. On his New Year's speech, he talked about electoral reforms. He's been talking about electoral reforms, but we need to hold him to account. And that can actually begin with the Edo elections and the Ondo elections, and how the security agencies ensure a level playing field for all the actors is very central to his public declaration and commitment to electoral reforms. And that's very important, because delivering on electoral reforms is a question of trust. Because the National Assembly has said electoral reforms, the Petroleum Industry and Governance Bill, as well as there's a third one, there are priority legislations for the National Assembly. And so we need to hold them to account to that commitment that they made. And lastly,